Hello and welcome to Puritan Historians for English 75A. We'll be talking about two individuals. First will be John Winthrop, the second will be Cotton Mather. And both of these individuals had very prominent positions in the early Puritan government, either in its more secular government. Oh, look, I got an email. Or in the religious government and the religious hierarchy. So let's go ahead and get started with John Winthrop. What we do need to know about him is that he did leave England for religious reasons, but he also had an economic stake in leaving too. There was a recession going on in England at the time, and his family's agricultural ventures were not doing so hot. So he decided rather, to immigrate to the New World and to work with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He left England in 1630 on the Arbella with 400 people, and they went to New England. And there, he worked to become the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, keep in mind that is the infrastructure that is put in place by the Massachusetts Bay Company in order to ensure that the colonists are thriving, and also that the economic ventures and the wealth and the resources are flowing freely from the colony back to the owners and the merchants in charge. Now, in that capacity, he wrote a very extensive journal, and in that journal we do have records of the way he attempted to manage the colony, including what he saw as some particular examples of witchcraft during its time. He is famously known during this witchcraft era for banishing Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. So one of the things that we'll have to keep in mind when we read John Winthrop's journal is the way in which he talks about instances of witchcraft. Now, Anne Hutchinson got in a lot of trouble because she asserted that God had revealed himself to her, and in those revelations told her about how the religion should really be. And here we get into some really, really fine points of doctrine and dogma that we might not consider to be a big deal. Why would people even care one way or another about this? But sometimes within certain spiritual practices, this straying away from one particular tenet to another really causes rifts. And, within those rifts, power struggles. And that was part of the problem at its core. And one of the things she said was that, that the body in some way was assumed up to heaven, or that, there was a different nature to the soul than what the Puritans believed. And she was speaking of those revelations to people in her home. So even though the relationship, oh my gosh, I'm gonna quit this. I'm gonna pause it right now because you guys don't want to hear our phone going off. Give me a second here. That was annoying. So what I was saying is that, Anne Hutchinson had these revelations come to her from God, as she said. And that is like at the core of Puritan belief, that contract with God, that individual relationship. But she was outside of the hierarchy and the power structure of the Puritans in Massachusetts. And so therefore her revelation was not seen as valid or as doctrinal, but as heretical, heresy, something that goes against a person's spiritual practices or faith. Another important point was that she was a woman speaking these things too. And that again goes against a lot of the principles and the hierarchical structure for the Puritans. So she was in all kinds of trouble from sideways. Now, a lot of the accusations about Anne Hutchinson were of a very special kind, and it basically accuses things of happening to her, or her happening to be in places causing things to happen to others. Ultimately, we will find out that Anne Hutchinson gets banished from the colony and that she delivers a child. And this is on page 194, but it is what is known as a monstrous birth, okay? And basically, it wasn't really any kind of full child, but a medical condition that has a very specific name, and that is hydatidform pregnancy or molar pregnancy. So it's a collection of tissue that doesn't really look like a human being, but it's just kind of an outgrowth of human tissue. But this was seen as monstrous, and this was seen as further proof that she was a heretic and that she did not have favor with God. Now, the problem with it is that, especially from our contemporary point of view, is that there are challenges to just the state of reasoning that we would find troubling. And especially one logical fallacy known as the causation fallacy. Now, this is a pretty old school traditional logical fallacy. Basically goes like this. In Latin, which I won't expect you to know, is post hoc ergo propter hoc. We put that in English: after this, therefore because of this. So, this monstrous birth that Anne Hutchinson has is seen as proof that she was outside of God's favor. So in other words, if we're looking at this statement right here, after this is the monstrous birth, therefore after her heresy, therefore because of the heresy. In other words, her monstrous birth was caused by it. And it could just be correlation. And now with all the medical knowledge we have, we would be very loath to believe that it was necessarily some kind of causation issue. And she even ends up being further banished, and in order for the journal to end the way it does, Winthrop wraps it up by basically saying that, there was an earthquake, and that finally at one point, what also happens then is at a later date, Winthrop records that the Native Americans actually find her in her house on her land and kill her and her family and her cattle. But whether it was the Native Americans or not, there's no real proof of this. And it's not really a Native American thing to burn cattle or livestock like that. That represents a very large amount of wealth. So there is a bit of suspicion among modern historians about whether that really was the way it went down. Most important thing to keep in mind here is that the evidence was very circumstantial, that Hutchinson was not in favor with God and was basically a very selective reading about the relationship of fairly normal human events to a fairly inscrutable divine will. And perhaps even better known as Cotton Mather, a huge figure within puritanical history. He graduated from Harvard, the first higher institution, in 1678 at the age of 15. Harvard there at that point was like a seminary. It was a school of religious training. And most universities started that way, at least the ones that are hundreds of years old. He's best known as being a Puritan preacher and a theologian. He came from a family of preachers and theologians. His father, whose name was Increase, like the verb, Increase Mather, was also very prominent. His father was the president of Harvard. Cotton Mather never got that position, maybe because of a speech impediment, and it kind of irked him. But the big point we really need to know about him is that he's the most prominent and well-known historian of the very first Puritans in the colonies of North America. He pretty much writes down the story and becomes the definitive word on it. He's also known as being the first nostalgic historian of the New World. In other words, at the time that he's writing, which seems way, way back in the past and way, way old school, he's already saying, oh boy, all these new people coming in. It's just not like the good old Puritan days now. Place is too big. There are too many people we don't know, and they're not taking Puritanism seriously enough. So he's already, getting kind of mopey and maudlin about um, where Puritanism is at this point, and it's a little bit exaggerated. Finally, he also made what were known as conduct books. And basically, what these books attempted to do was to help people of common birth um, learn how to imitate the values and the manners systems of people of the upper class. As if we're doing Marxist criticism, we can read a lot into that, right? Basically, this notion that if you perform like a different social or economic class, that will help you get to that class. You act and behave like the person just one or two rungs above you in that social ladder. Now, the interesting thing about it is that it's a very, very early instance of this idea of social mobility. And this theme is so important in American literature and American culture. You can start from any place and still make it. Now, whether or not that is still, supported by fact at this point is something we can examine later. But we can certainly see it as, perhaps the beginning moment of this uh, kind of sentiment. Okay, well, that was a little bit of a garble. Boy, everything going on today. That was a bit of a garble. My family walked through here. They had no idea what I was doing. But we're going to keep on pushing ahead here, talking a little bit about Cotton Mather. Now, like I said before, he was really from an institution of a family here and was known for their prominence and their puritanical influence. Here we see the headstone of one of Mather's grandsons. Interesting, you will notice some typographical differences. Notice the TH combined there in the Mather. Notice the superscript R for Mr. And you will notice that S in the middle person that looks like an F. You'll notice the S at the beginning looking like that F looking like an S also. For those of you, are slightly goth, I'm sure you'll appreciate that headstone as well. And in some ways, Mather had some important points about the colony changing. This was his house from 1688 to 1718. As you can tell, it's a pretty nice big house. So the idea of living a pure life is some way already compromised, even among those within the Puritan church hierarchy. That pretty much gives us a quick summation of Cotton Mather. We'll be reading about Martha Carrier and her relationship to the Puritan hierarchy and the accusations of the witch trial against her. And again, I do want you to think about that causation fallacy, post hoc ergo propter hoc. Martha Carrier says something or walks by or gives somebody a funny look, and then that person gets sick or gets a wound that won't heal, or their cow dies or something like that. And that's, oh man, this phone again. I'm going to pause it one more time. Okay, we're just going to blast through the end of this. Basically, like I was saying, think about how events that happen after Martha Carrier said something or did something are attributed to her as a witch. And that the only proof is basically circumstantial. There's this assumption that she made it happen. That concludes our look at the Puritan historians for the day. Now, if you've got other questions, feel free to meet up with me on Zoom, send me a text on Remind, or shoot me an email on Canvas. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you soon.